In this session, we will look at how banks in the United States compute and maintain cash reserves. The reserve requirements to be maintained by banks as mandated by the regulator in the United States will comprise cash reserves, that is, cash held in the bank vault as well as balances in the bank's account with the Federal Reserve. It does not include the bank's investments in government securities, that is, the equivalent of statutory liquidity that we saw in the case of India in the previous session. Cash reserve computation will cover only demand deposits or transaction accounts as they are commonly referred to. That means those accounts where the customer, the account holder, is allowed to make withdrawals and deposits at his or her discretion. Furthermore, the cash reserve to be maintained by any bank is a step function. For example, up to 10 million, 0%, 10 million to 50 million, 3%, greater than 50 million, 10%. We will see these computations in greater detail in just a little while from now. Please note that the above metrics that we just saw is only indicative and is dependent entirely on the directives issued by the regulator from time to time. Computing the cash reserves to be maintained is governed by two time periods: the reserve computation period and the reserve maintenance period, with a lag of 30 days between the start of the reserve computation period and the start of the reserve maintenance period. The reserve computation covers a 2-week period, always starting on a Tuesday and ending on the Monday after next. For example, the reserve computation period could start on Tuesday the 31st of May and end on Monday the 13th of June. The reserve maintenance period would therefore start with a lag of 30 days from the reserve computation period. That means from Thursday 30th June through to Wednesday 13th of July. The demand balances due from other banks in the system and cash items under collection are subtracted from the transaction account balances before we arrive at the net transaction account balance on which the cash reserve is to be computed. The computation of the reserve amount is based on the average balance of transactions account over the entire reserve computation period. Correspondingly, the compliance to reserve maintenance is also measured by the average of the cash reserve maintained over the reserve maintenance period. Any excess reserve maintained by the bank during the reserve maintenance period will be given credit in the subsequent reserve maintenance period. Failure to maintain the minimum reserve will result in a penalty imposed by the regulator. Let's look at a spreadsheet example to understand this in greater detail. As you can see, this spreadsheet has 3 segments. The first segment is what we call the reserve computation period. The second segment is where the actual computation is done, and the third is the reserve maintenance period. Let's go over each one of them one by one. The reserve computation period. The reserve computation period runs for 14 days. As you can see here, it starts on a Tuesday and goes through to the Monday after next, a total of 14 days. The balances in the transaction accounts and the definition of transaction accounts we have seen in the earlier video. The daily transaction account balances is given in this column. The total for the 14 days works out to 34081. In this column we have the total amount due from the banks, that is due to interbank transactions The next column is the total of the collection accounts for each of those 14 days, which basically represents amounts that are due to be collected, would probably be realized the following day. Now, the net transaction accounts, as you can see, is the balance in the transaction account minus what is due from the banks minus the collection accounts. So if you look at this figure of 2381, for example, it is 2801 minus 320 minus 100, which gives you a figure of 2381. A similar calculation is done for all of the 14 days, and that totals up to 28350, and if you divide that by 14, you get the average net of transaction accounts for this reserve computation period of 14 days of 2025. And the last column here relates to the cash held in the vault. This is physical cash that is in the custody of the bank for all the 14 days, and the average for that works out to 30.14. Do bear these two numbers in mind. This is the average of the net of the transaction accounts for the 14-day period, and this is the average in the cash vault for the 14-day period starting Tuesday the 31st of May through to Monday 13th of June. The second segment tells you how the reserves are to be computed. Recall from the earlier session, up to $10 million, no reserve need to be maintained. So 10 million into 0% gives you a 0. From $10 million to $50 million at 3%, so 40 million into 3% would give you 1.2, and all amounts greater than $50 million, which is 2025 minus 50 million into 10% gives you a figure of 197.50. So the total of these three is 0 plus 1.2 plus 197.50, which gives you a figure of 198.70. The cash in the vault is subtracted from that, which, as you recall, is 30.14, which is what we have reflected here, and therefore the minimum daily average reserve to be held is 198.70 minus 30.14 gives you a figure of 168.56. This is the minimum daily average reserve to be held. Now let's move over to how the actual reserves are maintained. Now the important date is the start date for the reserve maintenance. This date is 17 days from the last date of the reserve computation period, or a month from the start date of the reserve computation period. So with the dates we have considered, the reserve maintenance would start from 30th June, which is a Thursday, and go through to the Wednesday after next. This column tells you what is the balance held with the Federal Reserve by this bank for that fortnight. The treasurer of the bank has held the following amounts on those 14 days in its account with the Federal Reserve. Now the total of that works out to 2360, and the average works out to 168.57. Remember, the average to be maintained by the bank is 168.56. So this bank has, for this fortnight under consideration, met its reserve maintenance requirements. There are a couple of points to note here. Early in this cycle, the reserves held is very low, and it shoots up significantly towards the end of the 14-day period. The reason for that is the Federal Reserve does not pay any interest to banks for the amount they hold as a reserve with the Federal Reserve. So treasurers generally tend to keep somewhat of a low amount for the first few days and meet the shortfall in the last few days, because they are measured for meeting the reserve requirements on an average for this fortnight. So as long as he meets this average of 168.57 for the 14 days under consideration, that is 168.56, which is computed, the reserve targets for this bank have been met. This brings us to the end of our discussion on how liquidity is managed using cash reserves. In the next session, we will look at how solvency issues are proactively managed based on mandates from each country's banking regulator.